When it comes to music, album trilogies are everything but often. A series of albums recorded by the same artist with the same idea in mind and sometimes released around the same time is very hard to find. There's exceptions, of course, like David Bowie's Berlin Trilogy or the Songs of Trilogy by Leonard Cohen, but even in those cases, the albums were released right next to each other and are pretty much only connected by their sound palettes. But now imagine a trilogy where someone creates a concept and revisits that same concept with decades between the release dates. I know, it sounds like an impossible idea. Impossible unless your name is Paul McCartney. The McCartney trilogy has to be one of my favorites in the history of music, not only because individually the albums are pretty good, I mean McCartney I is one of my favorite albums of all time, but because of how original the idea behind the trilogy is. Usually, the albums of a trilogy are released around the same time and are made with a similar lyrical concept and sound palette in mind, but that's not the case with McCartney's trilogy at all. The first album was released in 1970, the second album was released in 1980, and the third album was released 40 years after that in 2020. And I know that you're probably thinking, okay, if they weren't released around the same time, then surely they share a similar sound palette. No. They couldn't be more different from each other, so what is it exactly that makes his three albums a trilogy? Well, it's the fact that performance, instrumentation, songwriting, and production is made by Paul McCartney. I know it sounds ridiculous, but it's the truth. Paul McCartney is in charge of every detail in these albums, with a few exceptions. George Martin helped with a few songs in McCartney III, and Linda provided backing vocals in McCartney I, but for the most part, Paul McCartney is the only mastermind in this entire project, and I think that's amazing. It's an incredible feat that only shows that he's a genius, not only when it comes to songwriting, but also producing and performing. And since recently I put myself through the suffering of listening to John Lennon's unfinished trilogy with Yoko Ono, I said, why not make a video about a trilogy that I like a lot more, and that is exactly what we're going to do today.
Paul, how often have you taken LSD?
4 times.
Now I have to be honest, even though McCartney I is one of my favorite albums of all time, I'm pretty sure that your first listen of the album is not going to be that positive, especially if you just came out of the Beatles discography and are hoping for a similar level of quality in the production and the recording and the overall songwriting of the record. I mean, half of the songs here are instrumentals. I remember the first time I heard this album, I was 15, maybe 16. I was living in South America, so I didn't have Apple Music or Spotify. I didn't have the money to buy the vinyl, so I had to search for the songs on YouTube and make a playlist in the order of the album. That's how I heard music back then. And the first time I listened to the record, I thought I had the wrong version of the album. I thought I was listening to the demos. I thought I was listening to the instrumentals because I couldn't believe that Paul McCartney, one of the greatest songwriters of all time, one of the leaders of the Beatles, had put out such an unfinished album as his debut. Especially when you consider the fact that John Lennon that same year released Plastic Ono Band and George Harrison had released All Things Must Pass, two of the greatest albums in the history of music. So what is this album? And it's not only that half of the songs here are instrumentals, it's also the fact that this album is so poorly produced. I mean, listening to this album for the first time feels something like this. I swear to God that you can hear every single breath out of McCartney's mouth. The drumming is so dry, percussion seems to not even be there, it's like, it's a really poorly produced album. I was so disappointed when I heard the album for the first time, but it's Paul McCartney, so I still gave it a couple more tries, and I realized the more I listen to the album, the more I like it, the more warmth and comfort I get from the record, and I understood why people liked it so much. This album feels very personal, it feels like you're with McCartney in the studio, creating or figuring out your own sound. And I also realized how unfair comparisons to All Things Must Pass and Plastic Ono Band were, because John and George were already putting out solo stuff even when they were with the Beatles, so they had an opportunity to figure out their sound before they put out their actual debut as solo artists. Paul McCartney didn't have that opportunity. That's what's happening in this album. Paul McCartney is trying to figure out what he wants from music, and in my opinion, that feeling of intimacy paired with uncertainty uncertainty is what makes this album such a magical experience. And if anyone wants to come here and tell me that this album is not even finished, it's rubbish, it's very poorly produced, I definitely agree with you, but I still believe this is one of his best albums because it's the feeling of being there with him, writing these songs, performing these tracks, producing the album that makes me enjoy it so much. Whenever I just want to listen to an album while I'm cooking something, on my way to work, maybe just because I want to read and I want something to play in the background, this is my go-to album. It's definitely one of the albums I've heard the most in my entire life because it gives me the feeling of comfort and the feeling of warmth that McCartney probably was feeling at the time when writing the songs from this album, because this was a really hard time for McCartney as a person. He was going through the process of accepting the fact the Beatles were no more. John left the band in September of 1969. Alan Klein was the new manager of the band against Paul McCartney's wishes, and Phil Spector was pretty much ruining every track he contributed to the Let It Be album. So it wasn't an easy time for Paul McCartney. He was going through a lot of mental health issues and mental breakdowns. It was actually thanks to Linda that he managed to overcome this really hard time in his life, and the reason why we have this album, so thank you, Linda. And if you're a Paul McCartney fan and you don't like this album, if you think that the production is too rubbish, if you think that there's barely any full songs in this record, maybe approach it with a different mindset. Think of this album as Paul McCartney trying to find his own sound, Paul McCartney trying to figure out who he is outside of the Beatles. And please, let's not forget the fact that this album has some incredible compositions as well, like Once Again, Maybe I'm Amazed, one of his best ballads, Junk, Man We Was Lonely, Every Night, Teddy Boy. This album was incredibly influential for the lo-fi genre, one of the first albums made at home, if you don't count Smiley Smile by the Beach Boys. There's a bunch of things I can say in praise of this album, but ultimately this was just a wonderful beginning of an amazing trilogy and one of the most intimate albums that Paul McCartney ever released, and that's the reason why I love it so much.
Substance cannabis is a whole lot less harmful than rum punch, whiskey, nicotine, and glue, all of which are perfectly legal.
McCartney II has to be one of the most unique albums in Paul McCartney's discography. Here we see him trying to tackle on the new wave and synth-pop genre, and honestly, it makes a pretty weird album. Not necessarily bad, but there's definitely a lot of ideas that didn't really end up as well as McCartney thought. Where McCartney I works as going back to basics, McCartney II does the exact opposite by trying to embrace the future of music, the many genres of the 80s that people like the Talking Heads were pioneering, and sometimes it works, in songs like Coming Up, the dance tune that is actually one of my favorite tracks by Paul McCartney. Some other songs like Frozen Jap, for example, or One of These Days with that weird echoed production and reverb in his voice. The problem is you also have songs like Temporary Secretary and Nobody Knows, some of his worst songs that completely ruined the track list for me. I know that there's a lot of people who like these tracks, but in my opinion, they're really, really bad. And listen, I'm glad that Paul McCartney is constantly trying to do new things. I'm happy that he knows how to embrace the new eras of music, but when he tries a little too hard and he forgets about what makes him Paul McCartney, that's when I think the experimentation doesn't work that well. In this album, it's clear to me that he wanted to be like those other synth-pop artists that were making music that was really claustrophobic, that was not based on melody, but overall sound and instrumentation. That's what he wanted to do. He wanted his performance and his voice to go to like the back seat and allow the instrumentation and the weirdness of the sounds in this album to take the front seat, to take the lead. And that's a good idea, like it was a good concept, but he didn't know how to do that, because the most amazing thing in a Paul McCartney album is always going to be his melodies, which is the reason why the greatest tracks in this album, Coming Up, Waterfalls, One of These Days, and Frozen Jap, are based on melody, not on instrumentation. I know that Frozen Jap is an instrumental, but the melody that he builds with the synths in that song is really, really nice and makes the song really enjoyable. But when you go to Nobody Knows, Dark Room, everything sounds so weird and out of place, then I can't even get through this album without doing something else. Like, whenever I go through the hassle of listening to this album, I'm always doing something else, playing chess on my computer, taking a shower, cooking something, but sitting down on a chair and listening to this album and not doing anything else, it's not the way I want to spend my evening. I'm gonna be annoyed or bored. When I'm not annoyed, I'm bored. When I'm not bored, I'm annoyed, and that's not really what I want to do with my time. I do think that this is a really important part of the trilogy. Paul McCartney was going through a lot of things, the separation of wings, being arrested in Japan. Like, his life was a total mess when he was recording this album, but for the most part, I think that this is probably the least enjoyable out of the three albums we have here, so yeah.
What's the secret to being 76 and still so hot?
Sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Okay.
I couldn't tell you how excited I was when I heard this album was going to be released. I was so deep in the lore of the Beatles. Paul McCartney was already my favorite artist of all time, so the third entry of the McCartney trilogy seemed like the greatest moment of my life. I mean, I was through the roof, and then I heard the album for the first time, and I loved every minute of it. In my opinion, this is one of the most underrated albums by Paul McCartney. The fact that he was able to produce every single song in here, with the exception of a few produced by George Martin, is impressive. It's remarkable. And I know a lot of you are probably thinking, what's the big deal? Didn't he do the same with McCartney I and II? Well, technically, yeah, but the production in McCartney I is not that great, and in McCartney II, the production is really, really confusing. I mean, he simply didn't know how to mix his voice with these new instrumentations he came up with. Instead, in McCartney III, the production is masterful, from the incredibly well put together Long-Tailed Winterbird, all the way up to the sharp, distorted drums of Find My Way, to the incredible group of a song like Deep Down and Deep Deep Feeling. There's so many positive things I can say about the production of this album, but that's not the only thing. The diversity of this album is also remarkable. Every single song in here has a different aura and atmosphere to it. That makes the record feel a little disconnected, you know, it doesn't flow that well, which is the main problem I have with the album, the fact that it feels more like a track list of a bunch of different experiments rather than an actual album. And that's not the case with the other two. I mean, the production may not be that great, but it flows really well thanks to the songwriting, unlike this one, but it compensates with a lot of variety, which I love. And listen, I'm by no means saying that this is one of the greatest albums ever. I don't even think it's one of the best Paul McCartney albums out there, but it's so nice and refreshing seeing Paul McCartney do something new, try new things, making music because he likes to make music, not because he has to. You know, Paul McCartney has enough money to fuck off and not worry about money for the rest of his life, and still, when faced with a lockdown, the man decides to go in the studio and make new music. And you know, the thought of that makes me so happy, and that is the reason why this album is so special to me. Once again, you have an amazing track list. For me, this is his best album since Chaos and Creation in the Backyard in 2005, and it makes me excited for a new Paul McCartney album sometime in the future, hopefully soon. But if I had to say the reason why I love this trilogy so much, it has to be because of this album. You know, it has to be because this trilogy seems to remind fans that Paul McCartney is nothing but a guy that likes to make music and likes to put out music. There's so many amazing albums by Paul McCartney out there, like Ram, Band on the Run, Venus and Mars, Flaming Pie, Chaos and Creation in the Backyard. But when I want an album to make me feel like I'm at home, when I want this feeling of warmth and comfort, I go to the McCartney trilogy, because there's not a single set of albums that can make me feel so at peace and so calm like this 3 albums, and I cannot explain why. I don't know why the idea of Paul McCartney taking care of every single sound in these albums makes me feel so happy, but it does. These are my comfort albums. These albums are my happy place. And while I'm willing to recognize that they're not the greatest, you know, I wouldn't think of any of these albums as part of the greatest of all time category, but when you listen to music as often as I do, eventually you'll find an album that has quite a few flaws, but for some reason, instead of ruining the experience of the album, those flaws are going to make the album relatable and are going to place the album in a special place in your heart, and that's exactly what happened to me with the McCartney trilogy.
Hi, I'm Paul McCartney. They say it's your birthday.
And that is going to be it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed watching as much as I enjoyed making it. If you did, go ahead and leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any other videos that I upload. This video is going to be quite different from usual. I tend to go into a lot of detail on what I like and I don't like about an album, but instead of focusing on the specifics, I wanted to make sure I explained why the McCartney trilogy was so special to me and why I think it's such a remarkable feat by Paul McCartney, and I think I did a really good job. But let me know your opinion. If you disagree with me on something I said, leave it down below in the comments, and I'll make sure to read it, give you my opinion on your opinion. Also, if you want me to talk about any other topics related to music, if you want me to check out a song, an album, or an artist, I'll leave it down below as well, and I'll make sure to read it and fulfill requests as soon as I can. Once again, I hope that you enjoyed, and I hope that I can see you soon with a new video. But until then, bye.